I remember the first time I realized that words could be both comforting and dangerous. I had been in love, or at least I thought I had been, with someone who seemed to promise me the world. Every conversation, every tender moment, every whispered plan about a future together felt like proof that we were building something solid, something that could last. He had a way with words that made me feel seen, understood, and cherished in a way I had never experienced before. He would say things like someday we would get married, or one day I would be yours in every sense of the word, and I believed him. I believed him because the love I felt for him was so strong that it made me ignore the subtle signs, the little cracks in the foundation that I now see so clearly. I ignored the times when he would change the subject when I mentioned the future, the times he would make vague promises without any follow-through, and the times I caught myself rationalizing his absence, his delays, his excuses, because love, I thought, required patience and understanding. I convinced myself that my devotion and unwavering belief were enough to hold us together, enough to nudge him toward the commitment I so desperately wanted. I waited, I hoped, and I forgave in ways that now make me wonder how I could have been so naive. Over the months, the excitement of our early days began to fade into a slow, lulling uncertainty. Every interaction started to carry the weight of expectation, and every promise he made seemed to hover in there without ever touching reality. I found myself measuring every word he said, analyzing every pause, every hesitation, every smile, searching for hidden truths that would confirm that he still loved me and that someday meant soon. I remember countless nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations in my head, and wondering if I was imagining things. The love I felt for him was no longer a gentle warmth but a heavy, consuming anxiety. I tried to tell myself that love required patience, that everyone moved at their own pace, but deep inside, a part of me knew that patience could only stretch so far before it snapped under the weight of disappointment. Then came the moment that broke something inside me. The moment when I realized that words without action were meaningless. I had planned a quiet evening, thinking it might be the right time to speak about the future, to ask him where we were headed, to see if the person I loved would finally make me a priority. He smiled, he listened, he nodded, but the answer I got was the same as always. Someday, he said, someday soon, but never a clear date, never a real commitment. I felt my chest tighten in that instant, a combination of anger, grief, and a dawning clarity. I realized that I had been holding onto a version of him that existed only in my imagination, a man who would honor his promises and who saw our love as something worth committing to fully. The reality was different. The reality was a man who enjoyed the comfort of my love, the stability I provided, and the assurance that no matter how long he delayed, I would still be there, waiting, hoping, forgiving. It took days, weeks, maybe months for me to process that realization, to let it sink in and settle like a stone in my chest. I felt betrayed, not in the dramatic sense of a sudden revelation, but in the slow, insidious way that trust erodes when promises are left unfulfilled. I questioned myself, as I am sure anyone in love does, wondering if I had been too demanding, too impatient, or too naive. But the truth I could not deny was that I deserved action, not words, and commitment, not excuses. I deserved someone whose promises carried weight, whose love was tangible, whose intentions were clear. I began to see the patterns that had been invisible to me before, the empty gestures, the postponed conversations, the constant deflection whenever the future was mentioned. It was painful to confront, but it was liberating to finally see clearly. I started small, with little acts of self-care that felt radical after so long of putting someone else's needs above my own. I took walks alone, sat in cafes with nothing but a notebook, and allowed myself to breathe without the constant tension of expectation. I spoke my mind more freely, even if my words trembled with the fear of confrontation, and I learned that silence was not always a betrayal of love but sometimes a shield for my own heart. Slowly, the weight on my chest began to lift, replaced by a cautious sense of empowerment. I was reclaiming my own narrative, realizing that the story of my life was mine to write, and I did not need someone else's hollow assurances to validate my worth. I also began to rediscover the things that made me feel alive outside of our relationship. I reconnected with hobbies and passions I had set aside, friendships that had quietly eroded under the pressure of my focus on him, and moments of solitude that reminded me of my own resilience. I laughed more freely, cried more honestly, and felt emotions in their full spectrum instead of bottling them up to maintain the fragile illusion of our future. Each day was a lesson in reclaiming myself and understanding that self-love is not selfish but essential. I started to feel lighter, more grounded, more certain that I could exist fully and joyfully without waiting for someone else's approval or commitment. There were difficult days, of course. Days when I would see couples walking hand in hand, when a song on the radio would remind me of him, when a text message arrived with empty promises and old habits. They would return. Sometimes sharply, sometimes as a dull, persistent thrum, but I learned to sit with it, to acknowledge it, and to remind myself that pain does not negate growth. The very fact that I could recognize the emptiness in his promises and choose myself over continued disappointment was a triumph. A reclaiming of agency that felt more powerful than any fleeting joy I had once experienced in his words. Over time, the clarity I gained transformed into a quiet confidence. I realized that my happiness was not dependent on someone else's timeline, that love is meaningful only when it is mutual and fully realized, and that I had the right to step away from relationships that offered only verbal comfort without tangible commitment. I met new people, explored new opportunities, and allowed myself to envision a future that was not tethered to the uncertainty of someone else's hesitation. I started to dream again, not for someone else's approval but for my own fulfillment, and each dream felt more attainable and more authentic than anything I had imagined in my past attachment. Choosing myself was not a singular moment but a continuous practice. A deliberate turning away from patterns of dependency and into the light of self-respect. I learned that forgiveness is not always about the other person but about freeing oneself from the heavy chains of expectation, resentment, and hope misplaced. I also discovered that boundaries are not walls but guides, helping me navigate relationships with clarity and integrity. I became more attuned to my own needs, desires, and emotions, understanding that honoring them was a form of love that I had long neglected. As the months passed, I looked back on my experience not with bitterness but with gratitude for the lessons it taught me. I understood that my heart had been strong enough to endure deception without breaking entirely, that my patience had been a testament to my capacity for hope, and that my eventual decision to step away was a manifestation of courage rather than surrender. I began to write, to speak, and to share my story, knowing that my journey could resonate with others who had felt trapped by empty promises and delayed commitments. There was a power in vulnerability, a freedom in honesty, and a profound joy in knowing that my worth was not defined by someone else's hesitation. Eventually, the narrative of waiting, of hoping for promises that never materialized, transformed into a story of reclamation, resilience, and renewal. I found strength in solitude, clarity in reflection, and a profound peace in the act of choosing myself. I no longer needed the assurance of someone else's words to validate my existence. My own voice, my own choices, and my own integrity were more than enough. Each day became a reaffirmation of self-respect, a celebration of independence, and a declaration that love, in its truest form, begins with oneself. I realized that life is too short to linger in the shadows of someone else's indecision, and that joy is found not in waiting for empty promises but in embracing one's own power, presence, and potential. As I continued on this path of self-discovery, I began to notice subtle changes in the way I perceived relationships, not only with romantic partners, but with friends, family, and even casual acquaintances. I realized that I had often allowed myself to shrink in order to accommodate others, to avoid conflict, or to maintain the illusion of harmony. But now, with the clarity I had gained, I began to assert myself more confidently. I spoke my mind when I disagreed, expressed my needs without apology, and embraced the quiet strength that came from honoring my own truth. There was a liberating sense of power in realizing that my voice mattered, that my choices mattered, and that my life did not require constant validation from anyone else. I discovered that being true to myself, even in small daily decisions, was a form of courage that built momentum and resilience over time. I also found joy in ordinary moments that I had previously overlooked. The morning sunlight streaming through the window, the aroma of coffee brewing, the rhythm of my own steps on a quiet street. All of these simple experiences became deeply meaningful as I learned to fully inhabit my own life. I allowed myself to explore hobbies I had abandoned, to travel to places I had always dreamed of, and to meet new people without the pressure of romantic expectation. Each new encounter, each new adventure, felt like a small victory, a reminder that life was abundant and that happiness could be cultivated from within rather than waiting to be gifted by someone else. Yet the journey was not without its shadows. There were moments of loneliness, when the absence of a partner or the silence of my apartment felt heavy. I wrestled with doubts, wondering if I had made a mistake, if I had been too harsh in stepping away, or if I would ever find someone capable of matching the depth of love I offered. But these moments gradually became opportunities for introspection rather than despair. I journaled my feelings, meditated, and sometimes simply sat in the quiet, letting myself feel fully without judgment. I learned to hold my own company with the same care I had once reserved for him, and in doing so, I discovered a profound sense of contentment that no external validation could replicate. Over time, I began to see patterns in my previous relationships that I had been blind to before. I understood that the cycle of waiting for empty promises had not been accidental but rooted in my own fears and conditioning. I realized that I had tolerated behaviors that were unacceptable, rationalized inconsistencies that were harmful, and deferred my own needs for the sake of imagined love. Acknowledging these truths was painful, but it was also incredibly freeing. I forgave myself for the mistakes I had made, not in order to absolve them entirely, but to release the guilt and shame that had weighed me down. I recognized that every experience, even the hurtful ones, had taught me something invaluable about boundaries, discernment, and the importance of self-respect. In the months that followed, I also found myself forming relationships that were healthier, more balanced, and rooted in mutual respect. Friendships deepened, and connections formed on the basis of shared values rather than convenience or emotional dependency. I met people who encouraged me to grow, who celebrated my independence, and who reminded me that meaningful relationships do not demand sacrifice of one's own identity. These experiences reinforced the lessons I had learned from my heartbreak, that love, when genuine, nurtures rather than diminishes, and that choosing oneself is never an act of selfishness but a prerequisite for true intimacy. I also noticed a shift in how I approached love and commitment. I no longer sought validation through someone else's promises or measured my worth by their level of interest. Instead, I approached potential relationships with curiosity, patience, and discernment. I asked difficult questions, observed actions more than words, and prioritized emotional safety above fleeting excitement. The clarity I gained allowed me to enjoy companionship without losing myself, to participate in love without becoming entangled in unhealthy patterns, and to appreciate the value of reciprocity in every connection. During this period of transformation, I discovered creative outlets that became essential to my healing and growth. I wrote extensively, documenting my thoughts, fears, hopes, and reflections. I painted, played music, and engaged in projects that required focus and imagination. Each act of creation reinforced my sense of agency and reminded me that my life was a canvas, one I had the power to shape according to my own vision. I found that expressing myself through art and writing was not only therapeutic but also empowering, giving me a voice that was independent of anyone else's expectations or limitations. Perhaps the most profound lesson I learned was the importance of patience with oneself. Choosing myself was not a one-time decision but a continual practice, a daily commitment to act in ways that honored my worth, respected my boundaries, and nurtured my growth. Some days were easier than others, and some setbacks reminded me that emotional healing is rarely linear. Yet even in moments of frustration or self-doubt, I recognized that the journey itself was valuable. Each step toward self-love, however small, strengthened my resilience and deepened my understanding of what I truly deserved. Eventually, I reached a point where I could reflect on my past without anger or regret. I saw my former partner not as a villain but as a catalyst, someone who inadvertently helped me discover the depth of my own strength and the clarity of my desires. I felt gratitude for the lessons learned, for the courage I had summoned, and for the freedom that came from making the conscious choice to prioritize myself. I realized that my life was no longer defined by waiting, by hoping for someone else to act, or by fearing that my worth was contingent upon another person's commitment. I had reclaimed my narrative, my voice, and my sense of purpose. Through this journey, I also came to appreciate the power of self-compassion. I learned to treat myself with the same kindness, patience, and understanding that I had once reserved for him. I celebrated my achievements, forgave my mistakes, and nurtured my emotional well-being with intention and care. In doing so, I discovered that love is not something we only give to others but something we cultivate within ourselves. The act of choosing oneself is an ongoing affirmation of that truth, a declaration that our happiness, growth, and fulfillment are a responsibility first and foremost. By the time I fully embraced this perspective, I felt a profound sense of liberation. Life no longer felt like a series of compromises or waiting game. Instead, it became an adventure, a series of opportunities to explore, create, and connect on my own terms. I found joy in small victories, meaning in everyday experiences, and confidence in the knowledge that I was capable of navigating life independently. The scars of past heartbreak remained, but they were no longer sources of pain. They were reminders of my resilience and my capacity to grow stronger through adversity. Choosing myself transformed not only my personal life but also my worldview. I became more empathetic toward others, understanding that everyone is on a journey, often struggling to balance love, expectation, and self-respect. I learned to support others without losing myself, to offer compassion without compromising boundaries, and to value authenticity above appearances. I found that when we choose ourselves, we are better equipped to form meaningful, balanced connections with those around us, creating relationships that are based on mutual respect, understanding, and genuine care. In the end, I realized that the journey from heartbreak to self-empowerment was not about finding someone else to complete me but about discovering that I was already whole. Love, fulfillment, and happiness were not destinations dependent on external validation but states of being cultivated through intentional choices, self-awareness, and unwavering commitment to my own growth. Every step I had taken, from the uncertainty, the waiting, the disappointment, to the eventual reclamation of my own power, had brought me closer to this understanding. I had learned that my worth was inherent, that my voice mattered, and that the most profound love I could ever experience was the love I gave to myself. As the days turned into months, I began to notice a subtle shift in the way I approached my own ambitions and goals. Before, I had often delayed pursuing my dreams, convincing myself that they could wait until I had someone beside me to support or validate them. I had put on hold my professional aspiration, my creative projects, and even simple desires like traveling to places I longed to see. Now, freed from the weight of waiting for someone else, I poured energy into myself. I enrolled in courses that had long intrigued me, challenged myself to step outside my comfort zones, and allowed curiosity to guide me in ways that I had previously ignored. The confidence I felt in my personal growth was exhilarating, and it reinforced the lesson that waiting for others' promises only robs us of time we could spend building our own lives. I also began to observe my relationships with a critical yet compassionate eye. Friends who had always been supportive became pillars of strength during this transformative period. I spent more time nurturing these connections, appreciating their loyalty, their humor, and their honesty. Conversely, relationships that had been draining, manipulative, or conditional naturally fell away, and rather than mourning these losses, I recognized them as necessary pruning to make room for healthier interactions. This process of refining my social circle mirrored the internal work I was doing, removing what no longer served me and making space for what truly mattered. One of the most profound changes was in the way I experienced love itself. I realized that love is not a finite resource given only when someone fulfills promises or meets expectations. It is a force that grows and thrives when it starts from within. The more I invested in myself emotionally, intellectually, Spiritually, the more capable I became of giving and receiving love authentically, I no longer sought validation from fleeting gestures or empty words. I understood that true connection is demonstrated through consistent action, mutual respect, and shared vulnerability. This clarity brought a sense of peace and freedom I had never known in my previous relationship, where uncertainty and longing had been constant companions. There were, of course, moments when memories of the past crept in. I would catch myself reflecting on what could have been or imagining conversations I might have had differently. I allowed myself to feel these emotions fully without shame, understanding that acknowledging pain does not mean giving it power over me. Instead, I used these moments as reminders of how far I had come and of the lessons embedded in each experience. I recognized that heartbreak, though painful, is often a teacher in disguise, guiding us towards self-awareness, resilience, and authenticity. Travel became one of the most liberating expressions of my newfound independence. I ventured to cities and countries I had always dreamed of seeing, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends who shared my curiosity and zest for life. Each journey was a celebration of autonomy, a tangible proof that I did not need to wait for someone else's approval to explore, enjoy, and grow. Standing on mountaintops, walking along unfamiliar streets, or simply sitting in a quiet cafe with a notebook and coffee, I felt a profound sense of self-possession. These experiences, rich in both observation and introspection, became a testament to the power of choosing oneself and embracing life fully, along the way. I also discovered the importance of daily rituals and routines that nurtured my well-being. Meditation, journaling, exercise, and mindful reflection became pillars of my self-care. These practices grounded me, reminding me that while external circumstances may fluctuate, the relationship I cultivated with myself could remain steady and sustaining. I noticed that even small acts of kindness toward myself, preparing a favorite meal, allowing rest without guilt, or celebrating personal accomplishments created ripples of joy that extended into other areas of life. The discipline of prioritizing my own needs became a radical affirmation of my worth, reinforcing the principle that self-love is not indulgence but necessity. As I continued to grow, I also embraced the idea of vulnerability in ways I had previously feared. I allowed myself to be honest with new acquaintances, to express my opinions openly, and to share my feelings without hiding behind defensiveness or people-pleasing. This vulnerability was not reckless, it was deliberate and informed by the wisdom I had gained through past mistakes. I realized that opening myself authentically to the world did not make me weak, it made me resilient. And in this openness, I found deeper, more meaningful connections, both platonic and romantic, that were rooted in honesty and mutual respect. I began to notice that my perception of time had shifted as well. Before, my focus had often been on the future, on waiting for promises to be fulfilled, on imagining what might happen. Now, I lived more fully in the present, savoring experiences without anxiety over outcomes. I learned to celebrate progress, no matter how incremental, and to find gratitude in moments that previously would have gone unnoticed. Walking in the park, listening to music that moved me, or even tackling mundane chores became opportunities to engage with life consciously, rather than mechanically. The present became a source of joy rather than a space filled with tension and longing. This transformation extended to my perspective on romance. I began to understand that healthy relationships are founded on equality, respect, and authenticity. I no longer tolerated vague promises or delayed commitments, recognizing that love without action is ultimately hollow. When new connections emerged, I approached them with clarity, asking hard questions and observing actions closely. I sought compatibility, shared values, and reciprocal effort, rather than succumbing to charm or fleeting affection. This approach not only protected my heart but also attracted people whose intentions aligned with mine, making the experiences richer and more rewarding. Through all of this, I discovered a sense of empowerment that I had never experienced before. I realized that my life was mine to shape, my choices mine to make, and my happiness mine to cultivate. No longer tethered to the uncertainty of another's promises, I embraced freedom in its fullest sense. I could pursue my passions, explore new relationships, travel, create, and love without reservation, because I had become my own foundation. This realization, simple in words but profound in feeling, transformed not only my personal life, but also my worldview, inspiring me to approach every decision with intentionality and courage. In retrospect, the journey from heartbreak to self-empowerment was neither linear nor easy. There were days of doubt, loneliness, and emotional fatigue. There were nights when I questioned whether choosing myself meant giving up hope for love or companionship. Yet, each challenge reinforced my resilience, each setback provided insight, and each act of self-care strengthened my independence. Over time, I came to understand that love for oneself is not a destination but a practice, an ongoing commitment that deepens with patience, reflection, and courage. By the time I fully integrated these lessons into my life, I felt a profound sense of peace and fulfillment. I no longer defined myself by past disappointments or unmet promises. I celebrated my growth, honored my boundaries, and cultivated a life rich with meaning, connection, and self-respect. I realized that choosing oneself is not an act of selfishness but an essential foundation for all forms of love, creativity, and personal fulfillment. It is a declaration that our lives, our dreams, and our happiness are ours to steward, and that no external promise or validation can replace the power of self-determination.